Hey, beautiful people. Thank you for tuning into History with Chemistry. Today we're going to be talking about the racism in the North. You can click the link in my description to follow me on Instagram and all my other socials, but this ain't about that. Let's get into it. So when it comes to racism in American history, a lot of people like to confine it to the South, and that's simply not fair, and it's not true because racism is deeply rooted in all of American culture, and it spewed all the way as north as Nova Scotia, Canada, which we're going to get into, and as far west as California. This is a nationwide problem, not just a Southern problem. Now, a lot of this is attributed to the fact that slavery is like one of the more well-known aspects of Black history and racist history in America, but we don't talk about it as like the redlining. We don't talk about the lynchings and all these different segregation and Black codes that were enforced, all these different, there's a lot of factors and microcosms when it comes to the grand scheme of racism. There's a lot of different things that is used to enforce these racist ideologies, mindsets, lifestyles, and whatever have you, right? It's important to know that slavery was utilized in all of the colonies. Some colonies, some states decided to abolish it later, but every single colony utilized slaves, enslaved Africans. And New York was not exempt. In fact, the very first slave market was built in New York, between Water Street and Wall Street. And not to mention, this was the second largest slave market in the world at that time. A little fun fact about Wall Street. Wall Street is named Wall Street because it was an actual brick wall built by enslaved Africans to protect the Dutch colonizers after they settled on this land from the British who were coming over trying to steal this land from the Dutch. Now, this was during the Revolutionary War. At one point, New York City had the second largest amount of slaves after Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston, South Carolina, yes. And this is during the making of New York City and the making of New York as we know it today. So this is literally the roots. Shortly after the Revolutionary War and toward the end of it, enslaved Africans made up 2,000 of the 10,000 people that resided in New York. Now, you wouldn't think that that'd be a big deal, but they were rapidly growing in numbers. That was one slave to every household. Now, them growing rapidly in numbers, it began to scare the white citizens in that country. You'll notice at least on my TikTok and on my Instagram, I'll emphasize how white fear was embedded in them being overthrown and what they were doing to Black people being done to them. So as Black people began to grow in numbers there, even if they were enslaved, they began to fear them. So there was a fire set ablaze, and I don't want to say it was done by a slave, although that there was enslaved people that admitted that they did it. They were under coercion. There was a fire that was set, and it ruined a big, beautiful house and a couple of shops. This led to, I want to say, like 50, 60 different enslaved people being brought out to the streets. They were hung, they were burned to death, they were everything you can think of. They were lynched. Now, a couple other hundred were sent to the Caribbean. If you don't know, I mention it a lot on my pages that being sent to the Caribbean, the Caribbean was a death sentence. You don't want to be sent back to the Caribbean because that's where you're going to go, and they don't care about your life. They don't care how much you make because they're coming in by the numbers. Every day, a new ship with hundreds of other enslaved Africans are coming. So your life is disposable. So hundreds of New York enslaved Africans were sent down to the Caribbean because this fire. This was a way to kind of control and reduce that Black population within the colony. Now, a lot of people don't know about the Revolutionary War and what it was. Just to briefly put it, the Dutch came here, stole land from the Native Americans, and the British came to try to steal land from the Dutch. They began a war, what we know as the Revolutionary War. That is relevant to Black history because when the British came over to fight the Dutch for their land in New York, they recruited some thousands of African enslaved people and said, if you fight for us and we win, we will give you your freedom. And if we don't win, we will still give you your freedom, but we have to send you somewhere else, which is Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is going to have their own video on this too because they are not exempt. But the British ultimately didn't win, and the Dutch did kick their asses. But the British did get to negotiate with the Dutch to release, I want to say it was like 2,000, 3,000 enslaved Africans to send them to Nova Scotia for their freedom and for their service in fighting the Revolutionary War. And this was granted. Some 3,000 people, African people, did go to Nova Scotia. That is how we have such a large Black Nova Scotian population today, and how Nova Scotian history is deeply, deeply connected to the Black Nova Scotians. We'll get into that, I promise you. Now, a lot of people will hear that and be like, oh, that's the Revolutionary War. That was the 1700s. New York isn't racist. We can jump into the 1800s because slavery in New York was not abolished until 1827. After New York was already established, or after New York was one of the richest colonies, the richest colony, the richest state. It had so much money built off the backs of these enslaved Africans. So they, of course, didn't need slaves anymore. And okay, that was the 1800s. Let's jump into the 1900s. All throughout the 1900s, New York was known for being racist. Yes, they had a large black population and they had the largest free black population during slavery. It doesn't mean that those black people were just given these liberties and rights and freedom to be humans that they were. No, they were still treated with racism, segregation, and even lynched. By the 1900s, white people got more strategic and they decided to start using Jim Crow, their own version of Jim Crow laws and redlining, creating the HOA systems. So much so that in 1991, there was a slave burial site built over Duane Street. So Duane Street is built over a 6-acre slave burial site that no one even knew about. There's no names, there's no log, there's no documentation of who these slaves belong to and who they even are. And that is a great representation of New York history just being swept under the rug. And before I get into other parts of New York, I want to get into the boroughs. I want to get into Queens, Harlem, Brooklyn, the Bronx, all of these different boroughs that are obviously segregated, right? There is an obvious difference in the average household income from the Upper West Side and the Upper Manhattan area and Brooklyn. And if you've ever been to New York, you'll notice that there's a lot of homeless people, there's a lot of drugs, there's a lot of crime, there's the housing alone. We ain't got to get into that because I'm not bashing the black communities. What I'm bashing is the systems that put these black communities in these positions. Versus if you go to Upper Manhattan, if you go even anywhere other than these boroughs, you will see the most beautiful home. And if you do go in these boroughs and see a beautiful home, I promise you they are gentrifying that area as well, which is rooted in racism. It's widely known what New York did to their active Black Panthers. A lot of people wonder why New York City, certain boroughs in New York City don't have a lot of trees, and that was also done strategically to make black people more uncomfortable, to take away that shade, to make them more hot, to get them away from these cities. They were purposely not planting trees in black neighborhoods or chopping trees down. The food droughts that's happening in the city. There's so many things that you could easily attribute to racism, but let's go into Buffalo, New York. Now, Buffalo saw a slew of lynchings shortly after the Great Migration and during the Great Migration, and it took a head in the 90s, with the 90s being the most racist era in Boston history. Buffalo, which was once an all-white city, saw a large influx of black citizens once sharecroppers began migrating up north to find jobs and a better life than in the South. This triggered something called white flight. Now, white flight in history, if you ever hear that term, it's when white people move out of a city, but they don't just leave and just take their own stuff. They leave and they take the banks, they take the grocery stores, they take everything that will make this community something worth living in and able to live in. And that's what happened in Buffalo. This actually led to, I want to say, just a number of like 5 different real estate companies and 2 banks in the city of Buffalo. And they began something called redlining. This may be a 2-part series because I really want to get into the deep details of what redlining happened in Buffalo because it was extremely strategic. Redlining is when companies would literally draw a map or get a map and put red lines around areas that had high population of black people so that you don't sell there, you don't give them loans, you don't open stores there, don't help people from here. That's what redlining is. This is actually going to go over into a 2-part series of racism in New York. If you haven't done so, click the link below, the big link tree. Give me a follow on Black Sky, Instagram, TikTok, all that good stuff. In the meantime, thanks for tuning into History with Chemistry. I'll see you soon.